everybody here okay? Okay. What I'm going to do today is focus primarily on the Constitution, the first two of those, Constitution, Congress, the constitutional provisions, their evolution, the history, and the laws pursuant thereof. The other sections concern problems of protection and succession that are different. There's one chapter on the Secret Service, which traces its history and the problems of protecting presidents in real life. And then I've got a couple, one on continuity of government and one on mass casualty events that's based upon work that the American Enterprise Institute and Brookings Institution, working together over a 20-year period, produced 4 reports, and I think they're very valuable, and they deal with some of the more esoteric problems. And then I've got 3 conclusions and recommendations. So with that slide, please. So I'm now going to actually read something from those AEI reports, because I picked them up, I read them, and I could not believe what I came across. All right. The scenario is hijacked plane crashes into the Capitol during the State of the Union address, and a couple of days later, when they pick through all the debris, they have a badly wounded president and other senior officials. Some are dead, and the president tries to go on TV, even though he has been injured, and reassure the public. So I'm going to read this quotation this is from the scenario. It was written in 2009. It goes like this. Even in the August setting of the Oval Office, perfect lighting and professional makeup cannot hide the fact that the president is not well. His frequent pauses, confusion over basic facts, and general demeanor frighten rather than reassure the American public. Slide. Now, these are various polls. You can read them, so I'm not going to test my speaking versus your reading skill. What it shows in general is that for the first time in a long time, age has become a real issue. There's various slides showing that the public thinks that both Trump and Biden are too old, more the latter. And then the latest one from this month, a poll that shows that voters, 62% of them think that if Joe Biden is reelected, that he will not live out his second term. Age really hadn't been an issue at the presidential level since Ronald Reagan ran for re-election against Walter Mondale. And it came up in a debate. Reagan, in the first one, took a drive down the San Bernardino Freeway. At the end of it, seemed to wander off a bit, and all of a sudden the age issue cropped up. And when Reagan was asked about it in the second debate, Reagan said that, yeah, he understood there had been concerns, and he said, I will say now, I am not going to use my opponent's youth and inexperience against him as an issue. The whole place broke up, even Mondale, and that, but this one, of course, is quite serious. Okay, this is the prefatory historical note. And what's astonishing here is this doesn't even count the near misses. For every one of these, there's a bunch of near misses and things that could have been quite consequential. And so 1 in 5 for presidents and 1 in 3 for vice presidents, not counting the 2 resignations. Just 1 in 3 died in office. And many security measures have been taken. But it's one thing for security measures to be taken, it's another thing for them to work. So you see those numbers down there. We had 37 3/4 years without a vice president before the passage of the 25th Amendment, including 14 months after JFK was taken from us, when Johnson didn't have a vice president and there was no procedure for replacing a vice president. Now let's go to the next slide. Okay, this actually is the full roadmap for what I'm going to be doing today. I started with assassinations because an assassination in a democratic country is the most serious disruption of the political order there is. In an instant, millions of votes are nullified. This isn't really a problem in dictatorships. People get killed all the time, and the public says, who's the next one we're going to have? But it is not normal, and I can tell you, as someone who lived through the 3 assassinations, horrific, well, others, but the 3 most well known from the 1960s, and anyone who has, the country has really never fully recovered from them even today, from JFK, Martin Luther King, and then RFK. Okay, these are some near misses, and there's actually a book which has that has probably 20 or 30 others that maybe were not quite as near misses. And they are some of the more consequential ones for near misses. The assassination attempt on FDR in 1933, he was president-elect, and he was lucky because Giuseppe Zangara, the would-be assassin, his arm was deflected at the last minute, and he killed the mayor of Chicago instead. And he didn't have, he was a classic loner and all that, but he didn't have any grievance against Roosevelt. He just had lived a life of almost constant pain that they couldn't cure. And he wanted the world to know about it. The reason he chose President-elect Roosevelt instead of Herbert Hoover was that he didn't want to go up where it was cold to try and shoot Hoover. There was absolutely no connection with any programmatic aim, as was the case with John Wilkes Booth, for example, and to some extent with Lee Harvey Oswald. So now here, this is at the very start. And what happened was that they had a few other things to do with the convention, like decide how many branches, division of federal and state power, and they never really got around to answering the question, and nor did they in the first Congress, where they also had a lot of things to do. But then in the second Congress, they actually did in 1792, and what they provided there was for the President pro tem of the Senate, and then the Speaker of the House, and then a special election was the only remedy. There was no thought then of cabinet succession. Now in 1886, by then, they had decided to try some other method. And so what they did in 1886 was they took the Congress, the 2 members of Congress, out of the line of succession entirely. And at that time, there were 7 cabinet departments. In 1947, the Speaker and pro tem were brought back in by Harry Truman. There was only one person in the administration who thought this was a good idea. It just happened to be the president. And the arguments that were made, and were made later and would still be made today, say, look, when people vote for a president, they vote for somebody who is an administration to be in power. They don't just vote for a person. And the counter was, well, we don't want people, cabinet members, for example, ahead of elected officials. But Truman said it's better to have a speaker than president pro tem. And the reason he said is because he's elected directly in a district. He has more connection. It's a more democratic body. But there are very few people who get votes because they're speaker. And usually those people are people like Nancy Pelosi who are never going to lose a race if they run. So, but those arguments were to surface later. Now the next slide, here are some of the things that happened in the meantime to show the measure of incertitude. The first one, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, William Henry Harrison, who was 67 years old when he took the oath on March 4th of 1841, he spoke for 2 hours in a pouring rain without wearing a coat. A cold rain. It's what happens when you don't listen to your mother. And a month later, he had left us. And so here is Tyler too. John Tyler comes in. And the discussion was, well, should we call him president? Look at the list there. They didn't know. And acting president is going to become very important, but I don't want to get into that now. So Tyler said he wanted to be president. Hey, wouldn't you? And he took the oath. He was sworn in, although there was no prescribed procedure for it. And when Andrew Johnson did the same after Lincoln's assassination, it became the accepted practice, but it was not formally enshrined into law. And really, that awaited the 25th Amendment. Now, the second thing there, July 10th was a day where we almost did not have a president, because on July 9th, 5 days after he crammed his stomach with strawberries and cream and a hot day out, so Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready, was not ready for the stomach ache he got. He passed away on the 9th of July. There was at that time a Speaker of the House, Howell Cobb of Georgia, who was 34 years old. You can't be president if you're 34 years old. You have to be 35, the previous 14 years a resident here, and you have to have been born here. So they had no president pro tem until the 11th of July. So had Fillmore, who was in ill health for much of this term, had he collapsed, a heart attack or whatever, and left us, we would have been without a president and with no procedure that could be implemented for it. So now then, Wilson here we'll get into more because that bears resemblance to the current situation, I would argue. And the regency there that was adopted was Edith Bowling Galt and Cary Grayson, the physician, and Joseph Tumulty, who was the private secretary. And they ran the country for 17 months. Wilson had a massive stroke. He was never going to be able to return. And he couldn't do certain things. He couldn't sign, he wasn't around to sign bills or veto them, or to veto bills when sent up. And so 28 bills were passed because he didn't have the option of vetoing them. So the country, it survived it, obviously. Meanwhile, the vice president, Alfred Marshall, wanted no part of this. He said that I don't want to get in the way of that woman, referring to the First Lady. So, and now, and the other one, of course, Ike, and this is what triggered the modern round. Ike, he had a heart attack in '55 in September, and it took him months to recuperate. Then he had a minor, some sort of obstruction in the stomach. That was a short outing. And then the last one, he had a stroke just after Thanksgiving in 1956. For 2 days, he could not speak. When he recovered his power of speech, he said to his chief of staff, Sherman Adams, if I can't do this, I just can't stay. And Sherman Adams called Vice President Nixon and said, be ready, you may be president within 24 hours. In the immediate aftermath of that, the American Bar Association was called up to help by Herbert Brownell, who was the Attorney General at the time. And the American Bar Association was a formidable force in those days. The chairman then, or president of the American Bar, was Lewis Powell, who 15 years later became an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court and nominated by, of all people, Richard Nixon. So they began to look in earnest at this thing. Let's see, next slide. And on the way there, it started in '58, and Eisenhower had actually penned a letter or a memorandum saying this is what happens if I'm disabled and unable to make decisions myself, which was actually adopted also by Kennedy and by LBJ until the 25th Amendment superseded that. And basically, as it approached 1960, the campaign got into full swing. And so then we had JFK, and everybody who said, well, this is great. I mean, we got a nice, healthy president, which he wasn't, but the world did not know. And so what happens then, see Birch Bayh there. Birch Bayh was a senator from Indiana. He was in the first term. He took the bull by the horns, so to speak, and said, we just can't have this. And Johnson backed him up on that, because Johnson, when he, in 1965, when he had a vice president, he said, this is a priority, we can't have this again. He went 14 months without a vice president there until Humphrey was sworn in. And the bills were called H.R. 1 and S1 for their priority. In '64, nothing happened. It was an election year, and so Bayh used the year to hold hearings, and they picked up a lot of things. During the hearings, they picked up a lot of things from the 1958, 57, 58 effort. So they had a head start, and the same issues were still there. So in '65, there was urgency, though, because what if the moment is lost? And they had to do it before the November '66 elections, because that was going to bring in a new Congress. And who knew who might not be on the committee? They'd have to start all over again. And they realized, the French have a wonderful phrase, we don't have anything quite like it in English, saisir le ballon bon, seize the ball on the bounce. It gets the motion that window of opportunity doesn't have, and also that carpe diem in Latin does not have also. It's just a sense of the urgency of it. So they were able to pass by overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate the bills. The Senate really went first because Birch Bayh was pushing this thing. And the 25th Amendment was then ratified within 14 months, one of the fastest ever ratifications. Became effective in February '67. And the genius of this amendment was that it did everything that was possible to do, and it put aside things that some people wanted to do but they didn't have consensus. And they understood, and there were debates about how much do you put in an amendment where you're encased in concrete, how much flexibility do you want in a statute, and various debates of that kind. And they just decided this is what we can do. And 3 out of 5 is pretty good for private sector work or government work. So the structure of it is very simple. Answering the question definitively in an amendment that John Tyler answered in 1841, it says that the vice president automatically succeeds the president and becomes president in doing so. Then section 2, well, now we need a procedure for vice presidential vacancy. So this is where they came up with the idea in section 2 of having the new president shall nominate. It doesn't say can think about it, nominate a vice president, the nominee must be confirmed by a majority vote in each House of Congress. They didn't want to place a supermajority because then you could have a minority really stop it if they could get more than 1/3. So they went through that, and then voluntary disability is number 3. And that was first informally invoked when Ronald Reagan in 1985 had some minor surgery. And it wasn't formally invoked until 2003. And again in 2007 when President Bush had a couple of colonoscopies. So some people call it the colonoscopy amendment. And and for 2 hours and some minutes each time, Richard B. Cheney was acting president. So here's where we'll talk a little bit about acting president. When acting president has the powers and duty of the president, but does not hold office. Now that sounds like, what's the difference? If you can do anything a president can do, so you just call the vice president. You may as well be called the Maharaji of Rajapur. Well, one thing you can't do is, you cannot nominate a replacement vice president because you are not the president. You do not hold the office. It says in section 1, the president shall nominate. Vice president can't do that. So so they got that thing in. And then the fourth part here is, and on 3, it is generally agreed in retrospect that Reagan people made a mistake in 1981. Ronald Reagan cheated death. He was very close. What was widely known at the time was that a Secret Service agent, Jerry Parr, when he saw blood, and they were taking him to the White House for security, and he says, go straight to the hospital. But there was something else that did not come out for many years. And that was that on the operating table, while Reagan was saying, honey, I forgot the duck, and I hope you're all Republicans and all that, a majority of the doctors and nurses later said they did not think he made it. He lost half his blood. He lost 6 pints of blood. They were having trouble finding a small nick in an artery, and if they hadn't found it, he probably would not have made it. But still, George Bush didn't want to have any part of looking like he was president. So he went with Marine too, because he was flying back from Texas at that point. He went straight to the vice president's residence about 3 miles away. And he worked out of the Oval Office. And he did not allow anybody to call this, your vice president is it. He went out of his way. But the fact is that he was certainly qualified if you looked at his resume. That is, they were afraid that the world would be unsettled. And in a way, I think they were more unsettled in my recollection of the time with this sort of a little bit up in the air. So there's that. Now, the challenge provisions of 4 are, let's go to the next slide. This is the one where we have learned from events just of the last few years. It is fundamentally unresolvable. You can only do so much. And I say this because you're almost always going to have a battle on it. And there are infinite gradations of disability. Does Joe Biden now have the ability to fully discharge presidential duties? Does he have the full level of cognition? And the answer to that is that we don't have an answer that the public and the leaders at large agree to. We have the press secretary saying he's doing just fine. We have a medical report that is 1 or 2 pages compared to the voluminous disclosures of prior presidents in recent terms. But we have a president and first lady who are determined to stay where they are. So what it shows is it's an impossible problem, and it came down to, let me see if I have the slides to show you. No, well, I'll go back to that. It came down to some stuff, some comments during the debates in 1965 and 66, and in the there was question raised about cabals, about some sort of conspiracy that would take advantage of the situation. And two people spoke up against that. And one was Birch Bayh, the sponsor, who said they would not do that in the white heat of publicity. They would come up to the plate. The second was Sam Ervin, who was a constitutional scholar, of course, and he said that if in a situation like that we don't come together, God help us, that some sort of civitas was necessary. We now have two parties in open civil war, pretty much, thankfully not shooting, and you could not get agreement on it. And that's because they couldn't, neither side could, that we can tell, could rise above their concerns in this matter. So it's a problem that will always depend on that. And if it doesn't exist, there's no provision that you could draft. Appoint a medical commission, that was thought about. Have a Supreme Court justice sit on it, who was shot down by Earl Warren as Chief Justice, and Lewis Powell, who later became Associate Justice, violate separation of powers. You just had to have that. Now, to go on here, let's see here. All right, this is events in 1973 and 74 that many of us lived through, and this is where sections 1 and 2 proved that it was possible in amazingly turbulent times to have an orderly succession. And for those who didn't live through it, October 1973 was one of the most tumultuous months in the history of the United States. You had a vice presidential resignation. That was 3 days after Yom Kippur War started, and Egypt and Syria tried to destroy the state of Israel. Later in the month, you had the Saturday Night Massacre, where Richard Nixon fired his special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, who was investigating him for wrongdoing, possible impeachment. And then a few days after that, the Russians threatened to introduce troops into the Middle East, and they had eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation in Mediterranean. Nixon declared a nuclear alert to DEFCON 3, which is, you're ready to go, but you haven't yet taken off. DEFCON 4, you're taking off, and DEFCON 5, just make sure you have a good bomb shelter. So that all happened in the span of 1 month. So those of us who lived through it, and of course, oh yes, the Arab oil embargo in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. So very turbulent month, but the succession worked in both cases. What they did was they choreographed it. Agnew had committed, took bribes and kickbacks as governor. Some he even took, I think, even as vice president. So the corruption was massive. At the time, one of the assistant attorney generals, one Robert Bork, said, he wrote a book called Saving Justice on the history of the Watergate affair, and his role in it. He said this was the clearest case of corruption he had ever seen, Agnew's case. So Agnew was out. Gerald Ford is nominated by Nixon. He's from Congress. Everybody likes Jerry. He isn't thought of as seriously going to run for president. And Ford, indeed, at his confirmation said he had no intention of running for president. Well, once you get to be president, they play hail to the chief when you enter the room, you begin to look at things differently. So for 2 months, that confirmation went on. And for those 2 months, there was no filling of the vice presidential vacancy, because until Ford was confirmed, your first in line, if God forbid something happened, was Carl Albert, a Democrat from Oklahoma, who was nobody's idea, not even his own, of being presidential timber. He said at the time, afterwards rather, looking back, every night he went to bed, he said, "Lord help us, please don't make this happen." He absolutely did not want it. So now, after the impeachment summer, and Richard Nixon has to turn over the tapes and all this, and they look at it, he now is, he resigns when a delegation of Republicans, some of his strongest supporters, go to him and say, "Listen, you have 3 votes in the House, you're going to be impeached, and you will be convicted in a trial in the Senate. For the good of the country, resign." And Nixon decided to do so a few days later. He resigns, and Ford nominates Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller was somewhat more controversial in the eyes of some people, and financial affairs, very wealthy guy and all this. And so it went on for 4 months before he was confirmed. And once again, Carl Albert was going to bed another 121 times saying, "Lord help me, please don't make this happen." So in here is where we get to the disabilities. You get to here, Reagan had his near miss and not invoked. And that, I talked about that a little earlier, so I don't have to go through that again, that slide. So now here are some presidential disability scenarios that I came up with. And the first 3 have historical antecedents, near antecedents. They end somewhat differently. One is the near precedent was Ike. Was a president decides, "I can't go on." And Eisenhower, who was a great president, I didn't appreciate it. I have an excuse. I was 5 years old when he was elected the first time, 9 years the second. He seemed like me, an old guy who could play golf, and he mumbled a lot. I later found out he had a few other things on his resume that called for some respect, D-Day and all that. And I might add, apropos that the present troubles, a quick aside, improvisational aside, he was president of Colombia before he ran for president. Both parties wanted him. And Colombia had just had a prior president, Nicholas Murray Butler, who was a virulent anti-Semite. And Ike stopped that when he got on. That stopped right away, because Eisenhower had, at the end of the war, ordered his generals, "You go look at the camps." He said, "You take pictures that nobody will be able to deny it." That is being tested at the moment. But he was an extraordinary man, and he had the character to do that. Now then, here, the second one, we have protracted disability, and this is Garfield. James Garfield in 1881 was shot, and he died as much as anything from medical malpractice as from assassin's bullet, because in those days they didn't observe sanitary practices in the United States, and that was they would fish around, and they didn't wash their hands or do anything. Oddly enough, Joseph Lister, American, developed the sterilization procedures that caught on instantly in Europe, but was not the majority view here. 100 years later, Ronald Reagan was near death, and this time he had great medical care, and he survived. Then here we've got the scenario number 3. This is the clandestine regency. That's really what's going on now. I don't think anybody believes that Biden is making most of the decisions. It's Obama's 3rd term, it's been called, plus Jill, who is not about to be dislodged as First Lady unless she is dragged out by horses. Then you've got 3 here that are sort of scenarios involving Kamala Harris. And basically, the idea is that at this point, they don't want her to be the candidate. They don't think she can win, Kamala. She's even more unpopular than Biden is at this point. And so they might just, this debate tomorrow night is really, I think, an audition for Biden to say if he can really last. And on the other hand, they can't push her aside that easily because she has some very strong identity politics constituencies. So it might happen at the convention. And then the last scenario is that they go with her and that they do get elected. And if they get elected, then she ascends to the Oval Office. So now we're skipping stuff in the book to go to my recommendations. The first one, I believe, is original. There have been proposals that the order not be in the order the departments were created. And the most common target was that between the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, they have a Treasury Secretary. Well, sometimes you have one who knows a lot about national security, someone like George Shultz or a Democrat like Lloyd Benson. Sometimes you have some who can't even spell national security, like Paul O'Neill under Bush 43 and under Obama, Timothy Geithner. But the quintessential example is 1977. Jimmy Carter took office. The 13th cabinet member, which was the number of departments then, was James Schlesinger. In front of him was only one. He was a former Secretary of Defense. He had headed the Atomic Energy Agency. He was hugely qualified to be Commander-in-Chief. The only one in front of him who had reasonably comparable qualifications was the Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown. A whole bunch of others, again, could not do that. So what I suggest is that you have a deck shuffling. President at any time when the cabinet changes, or when he becomes president, he inherits the default order. So if nobody's influenced by prior choices, he then shuffles the deck and puts them in the order that he thinks is best. It is sent to Congress, 10 calendar days, no legislative day shenanigans, Senate continuing body and all that. And up or down, you don't get to shuffle the deck. If you swap 13 with 8, you get my vote. And they have to disapprove by a 2/3 supermajority, so that's more than purely political, and the presumption should be that the president gets his way on this for smooth purposes. So now the middle one there, the Secret Service should be separated out and made a bureau, and the reason for that is very simple. There are little goldfish in a big pond with a lot of sharks swimming around, and their budgetary policies, I detail this in the book, they're consistently underfunded, serious manpower shortage, working to exhaustion because they're understaffed. And the way to get out of that is to have them have their own lake, and then they can argue their priorities and be a big fish in a small pond. And the last one, it arises out of the events of not only January 6th, but May 31st, 2020. On that date, and also in June of 2023, on that date, the protesters at the White House sought to break through the fence. 6 Secret Service agents were injured, some hospitalized, and inside the mansion, the president, first lady, and their son was taken to a safe room. They could not get the National Guard to come out. The mayor of D.C. Did nothing, because this is a foreign jurisdiction if you're a Republican. So we hope we can find some Democrats who realize this isn't a good idea. And then you had in 2023 someone who came with a gun and got close to Kavanaugh's residence, Judge Kavanaugh, when 6 of them were facing protesters over the abortion decision. So my solution to this is this. Since you can't count on the locals to help, the president be able to call Secret Service protection out to protect his family, the White House, as the seat of part of the seat of government. And in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice should be able to do the same. So if Merrick Garland, for partisan purposes, does not send the added security when someone with a gun had gotten close to the house, Chief Justice Roberts could order it. And I don't know that anybody else has recommended that, but that puts it at a par with Congress, which already they can order it, regardless of whose party has it. They have the authority. And that's to protect really the seats of our tripartite government. And with that, I will stop and I will take questions.